Except that my colleague Tabitha Bailey will be the actual moderator, and she's also in the call already. But nice to see you, Anna.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Are you well?
I am.
Yeah. Good.
Tab, are you online? There she is.
Hello. Yes, I am. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Hi. I would just like to ask the technical team, do we have one video or two videos? If it's only one video, then I am going to, without any further ado, hand over to Tabitha for your very interesting conversation on the diligence in conflict-affected areas. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Annika. So, hi everyone. We wanted to welcome all of you to this session and to also thank GlobeScan for inviting GRI to speak on such a critical issue, as well as also thanking all of you for joining. We understand that for some of you it's very early in the morning, and for some of you it's also very late. Also, some technical points. As already mentioned, the session will be recorded, and any questions throughout, please include them in the stream chat box. In this session, we're going to be exploring how the complex nature of conflict means that businesses have a heightened responsibility to conduct effective due diligence and also to continuously transparently communicate with their stakeholders. My name is Tab Bailey, and I'm a coordinator at GRI who will be hosting the session today. And I also have the pleasure of introducing the two speakers in this session. First, Peter Paul van der Wijs, who's our Chief External Affairs Officer at the GRI Secretariat, and also Andrea Pradilla, who is the Director of GRI's Regional Hub in Latin America, which is based in Bogota, Colombia. So as provider of the global best practice for impact reporting, GRI's mission is to deliver the highest level of transparency for organizational impacts on the economy, the environment, and also on people. From pioneering beginnings more than 20 years ago, GRI now offers a global disclosure framework that supports companies to be transparent about their sustainability performance and also accountable for their impacts on the world around them. GRI helps any business, irrespective of the sector, size, or geographic location, disclose their sustainability impacts, providing highly relevant insights for companies and their stakeholders, which can inform decision-making and improve environmental, social, and financial outcomes. The GRI's universal standards, which apply to all reporting organizations, consist of the following: GRI 1, Foundation 2021, GRI 2, General Disclosures 2021, and GRI 3, Material Topics 2021. These are the first and only reporting standards to fully reflect the due diligence expectations for sustainability impacts, including on human rights, that are set out in international intergovernmental instruments by the UN and the OECD. And the 2021 revision of the Universal Standards came into effect for reporting from the 1st of January 2023. However, of course, early adoption is always encouraged. GRI is an international organization with our secretariat based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and also the headquarters over Europe. And we also have several regional hubs that provide a presence around the world. We have staff in South Africa, covering the Sub-Saharan Africa region. We have staff in New Delhi, covering in India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. In our headquarters for the Greater China region is based in Hong Kong, covering mainland China, as well as Macau and Taiwan. We have our ASEAN hub, which is in Manila, the Philippines, and also Jakarta, Indonesia, and as well as Singapore, where we also cover Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. And of course, as already mentioned, we have Andrea, who heads our regional hub in Hispanic America, based in Colombia, but covering Peru, Argentina, and many other countries as well as staff in North America and Brazil. So in this session today, The aim is to examine how companies can undertake heightened due diligence when operating in conflict-affected areas or situations where there's a risk of conflict, and how they can also adopt a conflict-sensitive approach when analysing, mitigating, and preventing these risks and impacts. We'll be providing a lessons learned from the country of Colombia, which has seen one of the longest internal armed conflicts of the Western Hemisphere. We'll also be acknowledging the challenges of carrying out due diligence in the conflict context. And the event also aims to explore how, as changes occur over time, the balances of positive effects versus negative may be shifting. And we will also be emphasizing the importance of transparency towards stakeholders. And in the agenda, Peter Paul will first introduce the concept of due diligence and the role of transparency. Then he'll discuss how the complex nature of conflicts will also increases the criticalness of due diligence. Andrea will be presenting the country case study from Colombia, and then we'll be opening the floor for an open discussion and question and answer session with the audience. And then to close the session, we'll also summarize the main points and provide a key set of action points for policymakers, businesses, and civil society. But before we begin this session, we wanted to thank once again GlobeScan and also CSR Europe for this initiative. The war in Ukraine is the latest reminder of the fact that we live in an incredibly hostile and volatile world where war and conflicts can flare up anywhere and at any time. In today's session, we'll be looking at conflicts at large, not just between the traditional notion of wars between countries, but also looking at conflicts within countries and how this can test companies' commitment to sustainability and the role of transparency. We also, furthermore, wanted to offer a tribute to all people killed in conflicts and conflict-affected areas in light of the recent deaths of the indigenous leader Bruno Pereira and the journalist Dom Phillips, who were killed while they were on a research trip in the Amazon Havari Valley. I'll now pass over to my colleagues to carry out this session. Firstly, over to Peter Paul.
Rita, thank you very much, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone on the call. Thank you for taking the time to join this conversation and for your support for sustainability also in a time of crisis. As Tabitha mentioned, we are currently seeing conflicts between nations such as in the Ukraine, but in a way also in third countries such as in Syria, where the international community is fighting effectively each other in a third country. And finally, we see conflicts in countries between factions, for example, in Colombia, but we also see that in Nigeria, Myanmar, Yemen, and all elsewhere. So companies who just, as most other stakeholders, are not part of these conflicts, find themselves challenged in uncharted waters. How to protect their employees and adhere to their values while dealing with external pressures completely outside of their control. Often pushed by politics and external opinion to take decisive action without all the information and without indication whether the actions that are being pushed for are actually beneficial for the people suffering from the conflict. Note that I'm not even talking in that sentence before about potential business impacts, which would traditionally be the first concern of companies. But based on the conversations I've had over the past couple of weeks with large companies, I can assure you that in times of conflicts, these business considerations take a backseat to decision-making regards to staffing and more humanitarian considerations. So even though the outside world might not see that, for example, we've seen quite a number of companies reluctant to close operations in Russia. And the reason being, and I will get back to that later on in this presentation, was the concern for their staff, not the sales loss. They were even willing to accept a reputational hit in the rest of the world in order to ensure their staff was taken care of. Now, as a standard setter, GRI's role is focused on continuing to push for transparency, also about dilemmas and struggles a company has. Because when stakeholders stop talking to each other, the real problems begin and the chance of finding a solution is gone. My colleague Andrea will in a few minutes give you a real life example of this. So let me start with the concept of due diligence, which sits at the heart of the GRI standards. That's the requirement and responsibility of taking care that a reasonable business is expected to take before entering into an agreement or a contract with another party. Now, this requirement of business need to take care was formalized in 2011 when the United Nations adopted or endorsed the human rights guiding principles. Sorry, the United Nations guiding principles on human rights. These guiding principles state that all business enterprises have an independent responsibility to respect human rights, and that in order to do so, they are required to exercise human rights due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address impacts of human rights. It is important to note that this responsibility also applies to the environment and the economy, which is stipulated specifically in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which were also updated in 2011. Furthermore, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct provides practical support to enterprises on the implementation of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises by providing plain language explanations of its due diligence recommendations, as well as additional provisions. Now, embedding this concept of due diligence in guidelines and guidance is an important first step, but only when companies can be held accountable for the application of these does it become a powerful tool. And this is where the GRI standards come in. After all, our standards define and ensure transparency about the operations of companies. Principle 16 of the United Nations Guiding Principles stipulates that companies must have a publicly available due diligence commitment that has been communicated internally and externally to all personnel, business partners, and other relevant partners. The GRI standards, which were revised in 2011 to further integrate due diligence as a core concept, and are actually the first and only reporting standards globally to fully reflect the due diligence expectations for companies to manage sustainability impacts, include the due diligence requirements that were set out in the guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, and are therefore an important tool for companies who want and need to adhere to these principles and guidelines. So how does this principle of due diligence apply in conflicts? We have established that the principle requires companies to exercise human rights due diligence, which normally would require a pre-assessment of human rights risks and the establishment of a mitigation plan. However, in the case of a conflict, this is only a limited possibility. True, but, and I think we all agree, this is not a reason for not applying the principle. So Principle 7 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights outlines the need for heightened human rights due diligence processes and for the adoption of a conflict-sensitive approach, which emphasizes effectively preventing, managing, and addressing conflict, including by seeking to understand the conflict dynamics and related risks. One key component of that is that companies also need to continuously reassess the needs and impacts as conflicts either emerge or evolve dynamically. This is not a one-time exercise and you're done. Companies need to stay alert and stay focused on what's happening. In 2021, an EU regulation came into effect, which was called the Conflict Minerals Regulation, and that requires EU companies in the supply chain to ensure they import tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold from responsible and conflict-free sources, and put in place more specific mechanisms for conducting due diligence, for example, around the independence of a third-party audit of supply chain due diligence. And again, this is just another example of a regulation that's now taking the concept of due diligence and applying it to a specific standard. Now, next slide, if they're actually off. If not, that's fine too. Anyway, during the last couple of minutes, I've looked at the regulatory requirements when it comes to ensuring appropriate corporate behavior and the transparency around behavior. Now let's turn our attention to the actual operation of companies. And again, note that transparency around the behavior and impacts I'm addressing here are in large part covered in the GRI standards. The nature of companies and the nature of conflicts are factors which can increase the risk that the company's action and or operations may be contributing to or exacerbating conflict. So examples of different factors that can increase the risk include where there are weakened state government areas or areas of de facto control or dual political systems, for example, in non-sovereign state, presence of security forces and armed groups, emergency measures, complex operating environments, etc. So in 2020, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights published a report, which was called actually on the business and human rights in conflict-affected regions. And I think we will try to put a link to that report in the chat, and if not, we'll share it with you afterwards. And in that, it provided additional strategic considerations for businesses entering into conflicted areas. For example, a business needs to consider armed non-state actors. Sometimes it's impossible to operate in a region without having interaction with those groups. So how do you deal with that as a company? Gender laws. Businesses must realize that the specific experience of women and girls in conflict and post-conflict situations should be considered when they make decisions around their actions. Thirdly, responsible exit, where the steps are taken context dependent, and this includes providing reasonable notice to communities, suppliers, workers, and others when they decide to leave a certain region. Then there is this idea of captive businesses. So when businesses are dependent upon a conflict zone or resources with little chance of relocating, that will change the decision-making considerably for the company. And then the last point I want to raise here is this consideration of post-conflict. It's not enough to think about the conflict. Already at the start of the conflict and throughout managing it, companies should think about what's happening after the conflict. Reconstruction and peace building phases have specific requirements for companies in terms of how they act and how they conduct themselves. So considering the above, it is clear that due diligence action plans for companies depend greatly on the company's business model and also on the nature of the conflict. For example, a company that's a purveyor of medicine, is essential to food production and delivery, or transport will have specific risks and considerations related to how their withdrawal would and could harm civilians in the conflict zone, who may rely on the company, and their essential welfare should also be upheld. For example, workers may also be reliant on healthcare, health, and life insurance or pensions paid through that company. So if you leave an area, consider how to deal with those impacts and how to mitigate those impacts. This is one of those examples where the short-term decision to not immediately close shop is the right one, but one that outside the conflict zone might be frowned upon, and it can actually lead to short-term reputational damage. Being transparent about the reasons for not immediately closing shop or not moving out of an area is an important way of mitigating that external reputational damage. That for a company, of course, is something to really consider as well. There can also be challenges in situations when companies are unable to carry out a full impact assessment, which is why the role and the significance of human rights defenders and civil society in sharing critical on-the-ground information cannot be underestimated. This is especially the case in countries or conflict zones where there isn't an available or realistic redress for violations, and the local human rights defenders and NGOs are the only realistic means for people to report human rights abuses. As highlighted in the report of the UN Working Group, companies should not only develop an exit strategy, an exit plan, but also identify and assess the impacts of disengagement with affected people, including business partners and communities. For all these stakeholders, it should develop mitigation strategies, which include providing reasonable notice to communities, workers, and other partners of the pending disengagement. What's more, they should also try to ensure that staff continue to receive income for the duration of the crisis, or training and capacity building to mitigate the loss of employment. For example, Zara left Russia, but provided a support package for its 9,000 Russian staff. Another example is a Fortune 500 company which used its in-depth logistic knowledge to identify safe routes for their staff to flee from Eastern Ukraine. The UN guiding principles, the UNDP guidance heightened human rights due diligence business conflict aims to clarify this further and help companies to do the right thing. It reiterates that companies should consider whether exiting would exacerbate tensions within a conflict-affected setting, and whether the adverse impacts of the decision to exit or suspend the operations outweigh the benefits, and how they should develop mitigation strategies. This is a very recent published report, which we also will provide a link to in the chat. Our position is that transparency is a means of mitigating harm. And as the nature of conflict sees changes occur over time, the balance of positive effects versus negative effects may shift. So there must be continuous communication. Because of all what I've just stated, it is critical that companies communicate throughout the crisis as clearly and openly as possible with all stakeholders. There's no one size fits all. Each company will have to be specific on the impacts and consider those related to the nature of the conflict and the business model, and then share that with their stakeholders. In all scenarios, transparency is vital. Communicating limitations to civil society and partnering to effectively share information, but also communicating to internal staff and stakeholders. Now, in summary, in order to meet due diligence requirements, a company should consider the short-term and long-term impact of the conflict, assess the impacts a company has on societies and staff in affected areas, develop harm mitigation strategies, and continuously communicate openly with all stakeholders. And finally, some good news on that last point: the GRI standards, which have been developed using a thorough, independent, multi-stakeholder process, provide companies not only with a good overview of the topics to be considered, but also it provides for each topic clear indicators as to what stakeholders want to hear about this topic in relation to the company's actions. Things like human rights, corruption, environmental impacts, etc. Now, let's change gear here. And it's my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Andrea Padilla, who heads all our activities in Latin America and is based in Colombia. Andrea has been so kind to share with us the observations and lessons learned from living in a country torn apart by one of the longest running internal conflicts in modern days. Andrea.
Thank you, Peter Paul. Greetings, everyone from Colombia. Business conflict and peace has been a constant topic for Colombia that has gotten through many different stages since our internal armed conflict was originally recognized in the early 60s. I was born in conflict. My children were born in conflict. We have somehow managed to live throughout conflict. Our office, our GRI office, was actually established in the middle of conflict as well. And throughout all these stages, an element that has been essential to it all is trust. The need to build it, sustain it, and enhance it. Businesses need trust. Stakeholders need trust. State needs trust. And in my experience, as it happens through transparency, ethics, real commitment, and partnerships. According to the guiding principles on business and human rights, as Peter Paul already mentioned, companies are responsible for respecting human rights and providing remedy as needed. It's been 10 years since the guiding principles came about. And I remember they became a landmark here in Colombia. It was like finally someone said who was responsible for what. And when we were preparing for this webinar, one of the things I was sharing is that sometimes reality seems unreal when you operate in a conflict-affected area. According to the UNGP, due diligence conducted by businesses should not be attached to a particular physical space, but rather should address the impact of business operations and their business relations on human rights and their stakeholders. As mentioned, we've had one of the longest running armed conflicts in the Western Hemisphere. And for those of you that perhaps are not familiar with our location, you can see it on the map. We have guerrilla military groups and the state here, and a good part of the territory has been directly affected by the conflict. And many of those areas match the areas of business operation. You are going, if you are interested in learning more about our conflict, you're going to find many maps where they actually link, for instance, the operation of extractive sector where conflict is happening. Colombian companies and companies operating in Colombia both have been part of the conflict one way or another. And it took us a really long time to recognize that. I think one of the main issues we had here is that we were even afraid to say it, that we were part of the conflict, because it had taken so long and it brought so many emotions to all the parties that we were all very reluctant to first say we were operating in conflict-affected areas. And then when we did, to recognize what could have been a role in it. And something similar honestly happens with the population, because let's not forget, companies are people in the end. Let's go one further, one slide further. So companies have navigated the context of conflict in Colombia, I think, since they were established. And there, I think, are multiple dimensions to try to get it right. And I really want to emphasize try, because I think it's not necessarily easy to get it right. But I think what you really want is companies that are committed to try to get it right every day in every possible way. And one of the things we learned very early on is that the what through the UN NGPs was very much a welcome milestone in the way we were approaching the situation. But there were already many international humanitarian laws that were in place and regulations, and the what was not enough. Companies and their stakeholders needed more guidance on the how, and that guidance needed to be adapted to the local conflict and the local context. So the first component was to really understand that responsibility to respect in practice. In the case of our conflict, companies were operating in certain areas where there is no presence from the state, or the presence is very weak. So there was a temptation, or perhaps a long-standing custom, to try to replace the state in those areas, kind of getting into the duty to protect. So I think understanding who was doing what and how in practice, not so much in the main cities of Colombia, but in what we call the territory, was really difficult, because you would have communities needing certain things from someone, and then a weak state, weak institutions, and then a company needing to operate and trying to sometimes meet those expectations. Developing topic-specific guidance, and I'll discuss that in a little bit, was kind of the next step. You would understand the basics here, but then you would need to get into tiny details. Finding balance between international standards, regulations, norms, and reality. I think that was the most challenging. When you are part of a conflict, you feel it's so unique. The history, the nature, the parties involved, that truth is stranger than fiction. But in reality, there are many things that happen in many conflicts that you can learn from as a company and a stakeholder, but you have to still adapt to what makes sense to your reality. Finding the right partners to learn together by doing. I want to connect this with what I said on trust. Building trust among stakeholders is not an easy thing. And when you're working in a conflict, or you are trying to build peace, it's essential to build multi-stakeholder partnerships with unusual suspects. It's kind of easy to work just with other companies, or easier if you wish, but I think it's really valuable and much more difficult to work with civil society, to work with organizations that represent victims, to engage with the state. And that takes time, that takes commitment. Sometimes it looks like it will not move forward, but it's the only way forward. Dealing with issues of legacy became really, or has become really difficult. Companies tend to have new leaderships, right? And then you would have new leaders empowered with new tools, new ways of thinking, new approaches to conflict. And then they would try their very best, and sometimes the approach would not work. And when analyzing why, it's because you would have still legacy issues that were there, either linked to land, to historical situations that had taken place 20 or 30 years ago. So having a good understanding of the history of the conflict will support business actions. And it will help you set whatever intent you have today, frame it within the respect that history brings to the situation. And engaging with the stakeholders around impact is essential. And Peter Paul already spoke about this, the importance of connecting with the impact of companies through the tools of due diligence in general. I think where we are today is the best place where we have been at when it comes to due diligence. There have never been more tools or best practice examples, and I think more institutions and standards talking about due diligence. So it's a good moment to do it and really focus on that external impact companies may have. I want to develop a little bit about what I said on the topic, specific examples companies started working on here. The first one was guidance on how to build, maintain a relationship with security forces. So if you, for instance, have a company in the extractive sector industry, they would usually have facilities that need to be protected. And you would usually hire security forces to do that, or private security to do that. Or you would have to discuss agreements with, for instance, the military on how to secure those places. And there are many ways in which you can mitigate the risk of making the conflict worse if you are able to engage proactively and respecting human rights through your security actions. Let's remember, security is understood as the actions a company undertakes to ensure the protections of the assets, infrastructure, and property, but also the employees. Hence, the impact of actions undertaken for the effective provision of protection is also a responsibility of the company and must be part of its security or safety strategy. The second topic that was major was land acquisition. Usually when companies purchase land, they conduct a due diligence process. And 90% of the time that will be done at a law firm in one of the main cities. When you are purchasing land and there is a conflict, there is a different type of due diligence that needs to take place. And it cannot happen just at a law firm in a main city, but it has to take into consideration the different forms in which the land title may have changed throughout the years and throughout the conflict. Because hopefully in the post-conflict scene, this will be main essential for companies to understand, excuse me, how they acquired that land and how they were able to conduct that due diligence in that specific process. Due diligence on engagement with communities was another topic that was or has been very important in terms of how to respect Afro-Colombian communities, ancestral communities, indigenous communities, and conduct operations in a way that's respectful to the traditions of those organizations. This sort of topic, it brings into question the whole process of free, prior, and informed consent, especially for the extractive sector, and how to conduct that in a way that's respectful to communities, but at the same time is an understanding of the business model. Supply chain in due diligence, I think that was already previously discussed a little bit by Peter Paul, but I think one of the ways that's really key to understand is how powerful your supply chain can be in terms of building the economy, rebuilding the economy of those places. Sometimes, and I think it's really tricky for companies, stakeholders expect the company just to leave. And leaving is not always easy and will not always have the best impact for communities or for societies. It's sometimes engagement what's needed, and that requires companies to be very brave to explain that to stakeholders and say, I know you want me to leave right now, but leaving will do more harm than good. Decent work was another topic, especially with labor unions in this country. It became very important to be able to understand what that meant, how to protect leaders, how to make sure that you were offering decent work, but also your suppliers understood decent work. Grievance mechanism, I think, has been essential in our process, at least. People need to be heard. People need to be listened. They need to be able to tell their story and really heal from them. There are judicial and non-judicial, and that grievance mechanism kind of walks companies through both. Companies are much more sometimes prone to the judicial mechanism model, and so are victims and stakeholders. Let's go to the judiciary, but there are many things that can be addressed through non-judicial remedy. Institution building or strengthening. I mentioned it very briefly. I think it's important for companies to support local institutions, but supporting means not replacing the state. And I think that's really important. And last but not least, reporting and communication. I think it's really essential in building trust. When we opened our office here in 2014, in 3 years, Colombia became top 5 in the reporting countries in the GRI list with no regulation and laws. People would always ask me why, you would have these countries up there. And I said, my understanding is companies really saw sustainability reporting and GRI in particular as much more than a report. It really became a tool to engage with the stakeholders through a process that would have, of course, a milestone, a report where you could show what you were trying to do. But companies really wanted to be able to tell their story of how they were navigating this complex context and trying to do this part. And with that, I'm not saying it was perfect or it was easy, but I truly believe 2 of our principles in particular became really important for companies: stakeholder engagement, because it really made companies speak to their stakeholders. Reports stopped being a monologue and became a dialogue. And that was really difficult because that's where companies build social capital. And they're required to develop new things and new ways of talking to stakeholders, not just for a report, but to really understand and build trust. And I always say that's like a social capital account that companies have. And in times of crisis, you to the bank, you can use those resources and try to get out of that. And I think the second principle that was very important from GRI's point of view was the sustainability context principle. Back in the day, that principle really made companies think what were the development indicators of the areas where they were operating and how their operation may contribute to that. And in a way, that was an invitation in a fragmented country to try to align your operation to development needs of the community and the country in itself. So I think that was really powerful. Can we go one further? One slide. And then I like to say that, in the longest internal armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere, we've seen many stages. And in 2016, 2017, we saw kind of like a new stage. There was a peace agreement between the main guerrilla group and the state back in the day, with many different opinions about it on how it became. But back in the day, it really made companies engage with the topic of peace. I think there are 2 elements to this. One is the conflict itself, and the other element is building peace. And they're similar, but they're not the same, especially in terms of mindset and actions for companies. So end of conflict is not the same as building peace, but in both elements, what should guide companies, and this is a discussion we have here, is we're not asking you to have 2 completely different strategies. We're not asking you now to add this component or start working on the Sustainable Development Goals. In the end, what we're asking you is to do a good due diligence in human rights and include that as part of your strategy. Engage with your stakeholders, be transparent, and take care of your impact. If that is at the core of a company, navigating the different frameworks or landscapes should not be so difficult. You can call it responsible business conduct. You can call it ESG, as they call it now. You can call it SDGs, whatever framework of thought you're using. If you're really focusing on your due diligence, identifying impacts, taking care of your impacts, talking to your stakeholders, and reporting and communicating, it should not be as difficult. These discussions on where we are now have made it really clear that war and peace are not like one or the other, and are not black and white. We're actually full of grays, and it is often the case that the reality of headquarters, even within my country or the main cities, is very different from the reality of where the impact takes place. Going back to the due diligence concept that's in the GRI standards, it's not enough to do it from the headquarters, and it's not enough just to speak to the stakeholders that you know in the main city. You have to go talk to those that are the right holders, even if they don't have a voice at the moment, but you still know you have an impact. Because where you have an impact, you also have a risk as a company. The corporate approach should be based on a sound long-term process with impact at the center. And that's why I think, again, sustainability reporting became so important here, because it's a process that you do every year that forces companies and people within companies to ask themselves sometimes very uncomfortable questions that you're not ready to answer, but you need to ask yourself to move forward. You have to ensure as a company that you're doing no harm. And that's a tricky one and a difficult one for companies, because we don't want to say that we're doing harm. But sometimes that can be unintended harm, and sometimes it can be intended, because our supply chains are so large that it may happen even without knowing. We have to comply with the law, local and international. And if those two are checks, do no harm and comply with the law, go and enhance the positive impact you can make. I think multinationals have been part of the conflict. They caused part of the conflict, but they also gave us a very good opportunity to reconcile. I have many good stories because multinationals, in a way, were less emotionally involved than local companies. So they could, for instance, reincorporate former guerrilla members in their workforce much more easier than local companies. And then they could help navigate how you would have a victim, members from the military, former members from the guerrilla, all working with you in your company as part of your efforts. That's just one example, but I think there is a lot of good that can be done if companies embrace this responsibility of being part of the solution and accept when they were part of the problem as well. And I want to leave you with this: reporting is the result of a dialogue, not a monologue, and that's at the core of what needs to happen when you have a conflict. It makes a company recognize others beyond itself. It forces everyone to speak, but especially to listen. And I think that that's something that, even if it seems far now for the conflict that brings us here today, that you cannot lose sight of. It's the only way out. And I hope the lessons that I've shared serve others today.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was extremely, extremely interesting. And you certainly brought lessons that I think we can all learn and apply to any conflict, wherever the region, wherever the nature of the conflict or the company. These are certainly lessons that can be transferred and taken into account by any company. Now it's the time to move on to the final closing session of this event, where we'll be having an open Q&A and panel discussion. As it is right now, I can't see any questions in the stream chat box. And if anybody has any, please feel free to include them now. But we do also have some pre-prepared questions as well that we received in advance for this session. The first of which I will be handing over to Peter Paul, which is that how would you respond to companies who state that they already cover and communicate their due diligence policies in their sustainability reports, and that these are already publicly available?
Thank you, Tabitha. Thanks for that question. And also thanks to Andrea for sharing her lessons, because I think in Andrea's story was the answer to that question. It's not about the report, it's about what you do with it. And I think what Andrea was very skillful in explaining to us is it's the dialogue based on what you report and the engagement with your stakeholders where the value is. So yes, you need to do your report, and it's a good exercise to get a good sense of it, and you need to do it regularly, so at least annually, so you have the latest information and you consider changes that occur. But the real value of the report is not the report, it's the engagement afterwards. And I think Andrea shows some really good examples of how that works in real life, and that this is not just a statement by GRI in Amsterdam of a theory. It's really proven practice. I don't know if Andrea wants to add to that, but
I always can be better. You know, with due diligence, you can always go deeper, further.
Yeah.
So it's a learning curve. It's good that you have it in your report. Congratulations. I think that's a step. But the more you learn about human rights and the more you learn about sustainability, the more you know there is more to do. So be ambitious on due diligence.
Thank you. That's a very nice point to make. And as you said, of course, it's not about the report. It's about the action. It's about ensuring that you've integrated the local sustainability context, taking into account the short-term and the long-term impacts. We did also have a question, which I'll take to you, Peter Paul, which is what the GRI standards say about conflict. And given that we had some technical issues earlier sharing the slides, I'll actually put up the slide on the GRI standards in a second.
While you do that, and we're looking at your lovely dog. I think the answer to that, and I think both Andrea and I have tried to give that, the GRI standards provide an overview of the topics that companies should consider and engage with stakeholders. I think Andrea had that slide with the topics that clearly outlined the context, land use, governance, development work, and so on. I think what the GRI standards do and where they're very helpful is out of a process of independent multi-stakeholder engagement, they define what people actually want to know to really understand the impact that the company has. This is a very democratic process, if I can use that term, to get to that sense. So it's a starting point for that conversation, because we know that what we have in the standards, it doesn't cover everything, but it covers what is globally considered critically important to understand the issue and understand potentially impacts and how to deal with them. So that's where the standard starts. So it's in all the topics. There's not a specific standard on dealing with conflicts. It is throughout the standards, and it's also based on the company's assessment of the conflict and what's relevant in that conflict.
Thank you very much. I think that was a really nice way of explaining in practical terms the relationship between the GRI standards and due diligence. I think another question which I think was very politically relevant is to you, Andrea, which is, as we've seen this week, Colombia has recently had an election where we, as linking back to your discussions on reconciliation processes, post-conflicts, where we see ex-guerrilla fighters working alongside people previously on the opposition, we now see in Colombia that the government is now being led by an ex-guerrilla fighter. And I was wondering, of your perspectives as heading the GRI Latin American office, how you think that your role will be changing in this, GRI's role within Latin America.
Well, we stand for a GRI, which is impact, and having better businesses is a narrative that goes beyond whoever is empowered, to be honest. And the change in government that we're facing in August, I think, is a completely different direction, and different can be scary. And many of our companies are scared for this new administration. But I think it also offers a unique and exciting opportunity to get it right, you know? So I have chosen to be hopeful, and I have chosen to stand for what GRI has stood for a long time, which is sustainable development and reporting. I believe transparency will be crucial, not only because there has been a change in government, but because of the context we are in Latin America and in the world. Reporting will be essential. I do think that changes in governments throughout Latin America, at least in the key countries, are rooted in social unrest, you know, and in a major way, I think young people are behind this. New voters are behind this. And I think they connect very well with what GRI stands for and with our discussion on the need to focus on external impact to make this world better. And I think in that sense, we will connect with our stakeholders, and the state is one of them. But GRI has always been multi-stakeholder. And I think that's why I always say GRI belongs to everyone and to no one. And we belong to everyone. We belong to the cause of external impact and being able to bring that through standards and being able to measure that. So I think for GRI, it will be even more important to keep pushing for external impact and to be able to bring its standards to small and medium enterprises, which are the majority of companies in Latin America.
Thank you. I think that's, and also very pleased you brought up small and medium enterprises. I think this is also a group that's often severely underestimated in terms of their presence in the global supply chain. And I think definitely also brings in lots of the current conversations as well on international standards. And maybe Peter Paul, you'll also be able to provide some more information on this. We've been seeing a lot of conversations about how the standards of the EU being drafted by EFRAG and also the standards of the IFRS being drafted by the International Sustainability Standards Board will take all of this into account, as well as providing supporting measures to SMEs. And I was wondering if you'd be able to provide any comments on how conflict is intended to be addressed in these upcoming standards.
Thank you, Tab. Yeah, so I think building on what was said earlier, I think we see a strong movement around the globe in the EU, in the international financial community, which is where the ISSB plays, towards getting to grips with impacts and understanding impacts. And from that sense, it's very encouraging to see that both the European Union as well as the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation is working with GRI to include that impact aspect of a company's behavior much more closely in the standards and their reporting requirements. So we see a drive for mandatory reporting. We see a drive for inclusion of concepts like due diligence much deeper into these reporting standards, and I think that's good news. And we will continue to play a role in driving this forward. We have, as I stated in the beginning, worked with the OECD and the UN very closely to incorporate the UN guiding principles and the M&E guidelines in our standards, and we work with EFRAG and the IFRS to make sure that their standards are aligned with the authoritative instrument as well as ours. And as said, the standards are never the end. The standards will provide indication what to report on and how to start a dialogue. And I think so. I think that's good news. I think onwards and upwards in terms of global requirements for reporting and being more clear on due diligence. Before I close, and I see we're close at the end, I do want to repeat one thing that Andrea said, which I thought was very powerful. And it's worth repeating, and that this is, at the end of the day, this is not about the SDGs, this is not about a single company. This is about companies taking care of the impacts through due diligence and by being transparent. And it's not about do this at the headquarters and think you're done. This is about working in local communities with right owners to really deal with the impacts where they are felt. With that, let me hand it over back to you, Tabitha.
Thank you very much, Peter Paul. I see we received no other questions from the audience. In this case, then I will copy and paste into the chat box the documents and guiding tools that we referenced earlier in our discussion. Other than that, unless either you, Peter Paul, or you, Andrea, had any additional conversations, I think any comments to make, sorry, I think we can close the session to move for the next one.
Excellent. No, other than to thank CSR Europe and GlobeScan again for this opportunity. I see Jan and Chris have joined the conversation for the last session. Thank you very much for the opportunity and organizing this. And thanks all for participating in this session.